lumber they left 3 babies. In an icy creek, but a cowboy jumped to save them before they sank. The wind screamed across the valley like something wounded. Caleb Hart pulled his hat lower and leaned into it. Snow stung his face, sharp as needles. The storm had come fast that afternoon, the way Montana storms always did, turning the sky the color of old iron and burying the world in white. He trudged toward the barn, boots crunching through drifts that reached his knees. Inside, the horses stamped and snorted, their breath rising in soft clouds. Caleb forked hay into their stalls and ran a gloved hand along the neck of his old bay gelding. Dusty. "Easy now," he murmured. "We'll ride out the storm together, same as always." Same as always. Those 3 words had become the shape of his whole life. Feed the horses, check the fences, come back to a cold, quiet house where no one waited. He had lived this way for 6 long years, and he told himself he preferred it. But the truth sat heavier than that, buried deep where he tried not to look. He deserved the silence. He deserved the cold. The house behind him held things he could not bear to face. A child's wooden horse on the mantel. A dress hanging in a closet he never opened. A photograph turned face down on the dresser, because some mornings he could not look at her eyes without breaking apart. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. Sarah, his wife, and little Grace, only 5 years old. They had gone to town on a spring day when the river ran high. The wagon had slipped. Caleb had been away scouting for the army, doing his duty, protecting strangers when he should have been home protecting the 2 people who mattered most. By the time word reached him, they were already buried. He had not been there. He would never forgive himself for that. So he stayed out here, alone, on the far edge of the valley. Folks in town called him a hermit. Let them. Loneliness was the price a man paid for failing the people he loved. Caleb had decided that long ago, and he never once argued with the sentence. He led Dusty out into the storm. The fences needed checking. In weather like this, a broken rail meant lost cattle, and lost cattle meant animals frozen dead in the drifts by morning. Caleb rode slow along the property line, squinting through the swirling white. His fingers had gone numb inside his gloves. His shoulders ached from the cold. Near the low pasture, he found the damage. A section of fence had cracked under the weight of ice. The top rail snapped clean and dangling. Caleb dismounted and went to work, wrapping wire, bracing the broken post with a spare rail he kept lashed to his saddle. The wind fought him every step. His hands shook. But he had done this 1,000 times, and his body knew the work even when his mind drifted. The sun was sinking now, a dull orange smear behind the clouds. Long shadows stretched blue across the snow. The frozen creek lay just beyond the fence line, a ribbon of pale ice winding between the drifts. Caleb had always found something peaceful about that creek. In summer, it ran clear and cold over smooth stones. In winter, it froze solid and quiet, holding its breath until spring. He tied off the last strand of wire and straightened, pressing a hand to the small of his back. That was when he heard it. At first, he thought it was the wind. The storm made all kinds of sounds out here, moaning through the pines, whistling under the eaves of the barn. Caleb had learned long ago to ignore the tricks it played. But then it came again. A thin, high sound, rising and falling. Not the wind. Not an animal. Caleb went still. His heart began to pound in a way it had not pounded in years. A baby. It sounded like a baby crying. He shook his head hard, as if he could shake the thought loose. It was impossible. There were no children out here. There had not been a child on this land since the day he lost his own. Grief did strange things to a man's ears. He had heard Grace's laughter in the wind more times than he could count, only to turn and find nothing but snow. But the sound came a third time, louder now, desperate, coming from the direction of the frozen creek. Caleb's breath caught. Every instinct in him screamed that it could not be real. And yet, his feet were already moving, carrying him back to Dusty. He swung up into the saddle, his cold hands fumbling the reins. "Come on, boy," he said, his voice rough. "Come on." He turned the horse toward the creek and rode into the storm, unsure if he was chasing a ghost or something worse, but knowing, deep in his bones, that he could not ride away. Dusty broke through the last drift, and Caleb saw it. His whole body went cold in a way the storm could never touch. There, on the frozen creek, sat a basket. A simple wooden basket, the kind a woman might carry eggs in. But it was not eggs inside. Even from the bank, Caleb could see small shapes wriggling beneath a thin blanket dusted white with snow. Babies. Not one, not two, three. The basket rested on a wide sheet of ice, and that ice was moving. Slow but moving, drifting on the dark current that flowed beneath. Caleb's eyes followed the creek downstream and his stomach dropped. Not 30 feet away, the ice gave out entirely. A black gash of open water churned there, hungry and fast, swallowing chunks of ice as they slid into it. The basket was drifting straight toward it. "No," Caleb breathed. "No, no, no." He was off the horse before he knew he had moved. His mind roared with the truth of it. Someone had left these children here, set them out on the ice in the middle of a killing storm, and walked away. The cruelty of it stole his breath, but there was no time to feel it, no time for anything but the crying and the water and the seconds slipping past. He tore the coiled rope from his saddle. His fingers, already numb, fumbled at the knot. He looped one end around the fence post at the bank and yanked it tight, testing it with a hard pull. Then he tied the other end around his own waist, cinching it fast. "Hold on," he called out, though the babies could not understand him. "Hold on, I'm coming." He stepped onto the ice. It groaned beneath his boots. A long, low sound, like something waking up. Caleb dropped to his knees, then to his belly, spreading his weight the way a man learned to do when he had crossed frozen rivers with the army. He crawled, inch by inch, elbow over elbow, dragging himself toward the basket. The ice cracked. A white line shot out ahead of him, branching like lightning. Caleb froze. His heart slammed against his ribs. The basket was close now, so close. One of the babies had worked an arm free and waved it in the freezing air, tiny fingers grasping at nothing. "Almost there," he whispered. "Almost." He stretched out his hand. The ice broke. It happened all at once. The world dropped out from under him, and the creek swallowed him whole. The cold was not like cold at all. It was fire. It was a fist closing around his chest, crushing the air from his lungs. The current grabbed his legs and pulled, dragging him under the pale ceiling of ice above. Darkness closed over his head. For one terrible moment, Caleb thought of letting go. It would be easy. The cold was already turning gentle, already whispering that he could rest, that Sarah and Grace were waiting somewhere past the dark. Then he heard it, muffled through the water. A cry? Caleb kicked. He clawed at the rope around his waist, hauling himself hand over hand along it, fighting the current with everything he had left. His head broke the surface and he gasped, air tearing into his burning lungs. The basket was there, right there, rocking on the edge of the broken ice. He lunged and caught it. His arms shook. His body screamed, but he pulled the basket to his chest and locked it there, then dragged himself back along the rope, back toward the bank, back toward the horse and the fence post and the solid ground. The ice tore at his soaked clothes. The cold gnawed at his bones. He did not stop. He could not stop. His knees found the snowy bank. He collapsed onto it, the basket clutched against him, 3 small faces staring up through the falling snow. alive. All three of them, alive and crying and breathing. Caleb let out a broken sob that was half a laugh. "I've got you," he choked. "I've got you now." He forced himself to his feet, water freezing on his clothes, and gathered the basket close against his chest. Then he turned toward home, into the teeth of the storm, and began the long walk back to the ranch, holding 3 tiny lives against his heart and swearing with every step that he would keep them warm. The ranch house was cold and dark when Caleb shouldered the door open. He did not bother with a lamp. He went straight to the hearth, laid the basket down on the stone, and dropped to his knees before the dead fire. His hands shook so badly he could barely strike a match. The first one snapped. The second sputtered and died. On the third, he cupped his frozen fingers around the tiny flame and coaxed it into the kindling, blowing soft and steady until the wood caught and the light bloomed golden across the room. Only then did he look at them. 3 faces, red and wrinkled and streaked with tears. Their little mouths worked open and shut, crying weakly now, too tired and too cold to wail. Their lips had a bluish tinge that turned Caleb's stomach to ice, all over again. "No," he muttered. "No, you don't. Not tonight." He forgot his own soaked clothes. He forgot the way his teeth chattered and his boots squelched with creek water. He tore across the room to the old cedar chest that sat untouched in the corner, the one he never opened, and threw back the lid. Blankets. Soft ones. Ones that still smelled faintly of lavender after all these years. His hand closed around a small quilt, pale yellow, edged with tiny stitched flowers. Sarah had made it. She had bent over it night after night, humming to herself, her belly round with the child they had waited so long for. Grace had slept under this quilt. Grace had chewed the corner of it when her teeth came in. Caleb's throat closed. For a moment, he could not move. Then a baby cried, sharp and thin, and the sound cut clean through the memory. He carried the blankets back to the fire. One by one, he lifted the babies from the basket. He peeled away their wet wrappings with clumsy, careful hands and rubbed their tiny arms and legs, warming the cold from their skin the way he had once seen Sarah do. He wrapped each of them in dry wool, then in the yellow quilt, and laid them together in a row on the warm hearthstones. "There now," he whispered. "There." He fetched milk from the cold cellar and warmed it in a pan over the fire. He had no proper bottle, so he soaked a clean cloth and let them suckle it, one at a time, patient as the night wore on. The biggest one, a boy with a stubborn set to his jaw, took the milk hungrily. The 2 girls were smaller, quieter. One of them barely stirred, and Caleb held her against his bare chest under his shirt, sharing what little warmth he had left, murmuring low until at last she began to squirm and fuss and cry. He had never been so glad to hear a baby cry. The hours crawled by. Caleb did not sleep. He fed them and warmed them and paced the floor with one, then another, then all 3 tucked into the crook of his arms. The storm howled against the windows. The fire crackled and popped, and somewhere in the deep dark middle of that night, holding these 3 small strangers, Caleb Hart wept for the first time in 5 long years. He wept for Sarah. He wept for Grace. He wept for the man he used to be, the one who believed he had nothing left inside him worth giving. "I've got you," he said again over and over, until the words stopped being for them and became a promise to himself. "I've got you." Morning came gray and quiet. The storm had spent itself in the night, leaving the world buried and still and white. That was how Martha Whitaker found him. She had come to check on her neighbor, worried by the smoke curling from his chimney at such an early hour. She pushed open the door, stamping snow from her boots, a scold already halfway to her lips. The scold died there. Caleb Hart sat slumped against the hearthstones, half asleep, his clothes stiff with dried creek water. And cradled against his chest Wrapped in a faded yellow quilt she remembered all too well, lay 3 sleeping babies. Martha's hand rose to her mouth. The lonely cowboy had been given something back. She saw it plain as morning light, a second chance to love. For a long moment, Martha simply stood in the doorway and looked. Then she came alive all at once, the way she did when there was work to be done. She shut the door against the cold and crossed the room in 3 quick steps. "Caleb Hart, you're soaked through to the bone." Her voice was rough with feeling, but her hands were already moving, tucking the quilt tighter around the babies. "You'll catch your death, and then who'll look after these little ones? Get out of those wet things. Go on." Caleb blinked up at her, slow and dazed, as if he had forgotten how to speak. "Martha," he said. "They were on the creek. Somebody left them on the ice." Her jaw tightened. She did not ask fool questions. She simply nodded once and took the smallest baby from his arms so gently the little girl never stirred. "You can tell me all of it," she said. "But first, you'll get warm and you'll eat something. These babies need you standing, not laid up sick." He did as he was told. There was comfort in it, in being ordered about by a woman who knew what she was doing. He changed into dry clothes while Martha built up the fire and warmed more milk, and clucked over each tiny face like a hen with new chicks. "This one's got a good strong cry," she said, lifting the boy. "And look at the fists on him. He'll be a handful." Caleb almost smiled. Almost. Word travels fast in a small valley, even one buried in snow. By mid-morning, the first sleigh came jingling up the lane. It was the Petersons, and Mrs. Peterson carried a basket of eggs and a jar of goat's milk. Behind them came the Hollises with a bundle of clean rags cut for diapers, and then old Amos Finch leading a milk cow through the drifts on a rope, saying only, "Babies need milk. This here's the gentlest cow I got." They came all morning. Caleb had lived on that ranch 5 years and had let almost none of them past his gate. Now they filled his small house with the stamp of boots and the smell of fresh bread and the low murmur of kind voices. Someone brought a proper glass bottle. Someone else brought a wooden cradle, dusty from an attic, and set it by the fire. "We heard what you did," said Mr. Peterson, turning his hat in his hands. "Went out on that ice, in this storm." He shook his head. "That took nerve, Caleb. Not many men would have." Caleb looked at his boots. "Any man would have if he heard them crying." "No," Martha said firmly from across the room. "Not any man. Him." He did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing. But something warm moved in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. The babies slept and woke and fed and slept again. The women showed him how to hold them just so, how to burp them and rock them and read the different meanings in their cries. By afternoon, Caleb could tell the boy from the 2 girls without looking, just by the sound. The light was going golden and thin when he heard hoofbeats in the yard, heavy and unhurried. Caleb went to the window. A big bay horse stood steaming in the cold, and swinging down from the saddle was Sheriff Tom Dawson, his star catching the last of the daylight. Martha met Caleb's eyes. The room went quiet. Dawson knocked and let himself in, pulling off his gloves. He was a broad, weathered man with careful eyes that took in the whole room, the babies, the neighbors, the cradle before he spoke. "Caleb," he said, nodding. "Heard you had yourself a night." "Sheriff." Dawson glanced at the sleeping infants, and for a moment his hard face softened. Then he reached into his coat and drew out something small, wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth. "Found this tucked in the bottom of that basket," he said, "under the padding. Somebody hid it there on purpose." He held it out on his open palm. "Thought you ought to see it? Because if I'm not mistaken, Caleb, this thing belongs to somebody you used to know." Caleb crossed the room slowly. His boots felt heavy, though he had walked that floor 1,000 times. Dawson turned back the corners of the oilcloth. There, resting in the folds, lay a medal, small, tarnished with age. A bronze star hung from a strip of faded blue ribbon, worn thin at the edges, where a thumb might rub it over and over in quiet moments. Caleb stopped breathing. He knew that medal. He had seen it 100 times, pinned to a chest across a campfire, held up in a shaking hand on a cold night when the fear got too big to carry alone. He knew the little dent near the top point, where a bullet had grazed it once and left its mark. His hand shook as he reached for it. "May I?" His voice came out rough. Dawson nodded and tipped it into Caleb's palm. It was lighter than he remembered. Or maybe it was that everything else in him had gone so heavy at once. Caleb closed his fingers around the cold metal and felt the years fall away like snow off a roof. "Daniel," he whispered. The room had gone still. Martha watched him, a baby on her shoulder, her face soft with worry. The neighbors had grown quiet too, sensing something they did not understand. "You know it then," Dawson said. It was not really a question. "I know it." Caleb sat down hard in the chair by the fire, as if his legs had simply quit. He turned the medal over. On the back, scratched in by hand years ago, were 2 small letters. D.B. Daniel Boone. "He was my friend," Caleb said. The words came out slow, like they cost him something. "Best I ever had. We were scouts together back in the Army days. Went places most men never came home from." He rubbed his thumb across the ribbon, the same way Daniel used to. "He saved my life more times than I can count. And I—" His voice broke off. Martha came and stood beside him. She did not speak. She only rested a hand on his shoulder, and it was enough. "I thought he was dead," Caleb went on. 20 years, near about. There was a mission gone wrong. We got separated. When the dust cleared, they told me he was gone. I never saw his body. I never got to." He shook his head. "I always figured that was just how it went. War takes men and doesn't ask." Dawson eased down onto the bench across from him, his hat between his hands. "Caleb," he said carefully, "you know whose medal that is. But do you know whose children these are?" Caleb looked up. The fire popped. One of the babies made a small sound in her sleep. "Daniel had a daughter," Caleb said. The memory rose up whole and sudden, so clear it hurt. A younger Daniel, grinning by a low fire, pulling a folded paper from his coat. A little girl with dark braids and her father's stubborn chin. Eliza. He carried her picture everywhere. Talked about her more than he talked about anything. His throat tightened. He made me promise, the night before that last mission. Made me swear that if anything ever happened to him, I'd look after her, keep her safe. The words hung in the warm room like smoke. "I never kept it," Caleb said. His voice had gone hollow. "I thought he was dead, so I thought the promise died with him. I never went to find her, never even tried." He stared down at the 3 sleeping faces in the cradle, at the boy's stubborn little fists, at the smallest girl's dark hair. His chest ached in a way it had not ached in years. "These are hers, aren't they? Daniel's grandbabies, Eliza's children." Dawson nodded slow. "Her name's on record, Eliza Boone. These are her 3. Caleb closed his eyes. 20 years of running from a grave he never dug. A promise he had folded up small and buried deep, telling himself there was no one left to keep it for. And now, here were 3 tiny lives, pulled from the ice by his own 2 hands, carrying the last piece of the man he had failed. The guilt he had buried came climbing up out of the dark, and this time he had no place left to hide it. The next morning came gray and quiet, the storm finally spent. Snow lay deep across the yard, but inside the ranch house, something had shifted. Caleb woke before the sun, He had not meant to sleep at all, sitting up in the chair by the fire. But somewhere in the small hours, his body had given out. He woke to the sound of a baby fussing, and for one strange moment, his heart forgot to hurt. It only moved. He rose and crossed to the cradle. The boy, Samuel, had kicked his blanket loose and lay red-faced and squirming. Caleb reached down without thinking. He gathered the little one up against his chest, and Samuel quieted almost at once, small fingers curling into the fabric of Caleb's shirt. "There now," Caleb murmured. "There, I got you." He had said those same words before. Years ago, to another child, in another life. The memory did not knock him flat the way he expected. It simply sat beside him, quiet and sad and somehow bearable. Martha found him like that when she came in from the cold, her arms full of fresh milk and clean cloth. She stopped in the doorway and looked at him a long moment. She did not say anything, but her eyes went soft, and she smiled to herself as she set her load on the table. "You've got a knack for it," she said. "Some men are all thumbs with the little ones, not you." "Been a long time," Caleb said. "Doesn't leave you. That kind of knowing." She rolled up her sleeves. "Now, come on. These three eat like they've been starved a week, and I can't do it alone." They spent the day working side by side. Martha showed him how to warm the milk just right, how to test it against his wrist. She showed him how to hold Rose, the smallest one, whose cry was thin and needful. Clara took to Caleb quickest of all. She would stare up at his weathered face with wide dark eyes, and when he talked to her, low and slow, she seemed to listen. By afternoon, the house did not feel like the same house. There was noise in it. There was the soft sound of babies breathing, the clink of tin cups, Martha humming an old hymn under her breath as she stirred the fire. The emptiness that had lived in those walls for years had been pushed back into the corners. Caleb noticed it, and it scared him. He stood at the window while the baby slept, watching the light fade over the white fields, and felt his chest tighten. He knew this feeling. He knew how it ended. You let something matter, and then the world took it, and you were left standing in a house full of echoes. "You've gone quiet," Martha said behind him. "Thinking." "About what?" Caleb was slow to answer. "About how easy it'd be," he said, "to let myself want this, and how much it'd cost when it's gone." Martha came to stand beside him. "Who says it's got to go?" "Everything goes, Martha. You know that better than most." She was quiet a moment, then she reached over and squeezed his arm. "Some things do, but you can't stop living just to keep from hurting. That's not living at all. That's just waiting to die slow." Before Caleb could answer, hooves sounded in the yard. He looked out. A fine black horse came up the lane, high-stepping through the snow, and on its back sat a man in a heavy coat with a fur collar. Caleb knew him even at a distance. Everyone in the county knew Silas Crowley. Caleb opened the door before the man could knock. "Mr. Hart." Silas swung down and came up the steps, smiling wide, his gloved hand extended. "I heard about what you did. The whole valley's talking. A brave thing, a Christian thing." Caleb did not take the hand. Word travels fast. It does when a man's a hero. Silas stepped past him into the warmth without being asked. His sharp eyes swept the room, and Caleb watched them land on the cradle. Something flickered there, not tenderness, something colder. "Those the little ones?" Silas asked. "They are." Silas clasped his hands behind his back. "Then I'm afraid I've got some hard news for you. The mother, Eliza Boone." He shook his head slowly. "She abandoned these children, left them to die out there on that ice. And she's a wanted woman now, Mr. Hart. Crimes against my person. Attempted murder, no less. Caleb said nothing. He watched the man's face. A terrible business, Silas went on, but there was no grief in his voice. His gaze kept drifting back to the cradle, quick and hungry, like a man counting coins. You've done your part, more than any man could ask, but children like these need proper care. I'd be glad to see them placed somewhere safe. Take the burden off you entirely. Today, even if you're willing. Caleb followed the man's eyes to the 3 sleeping babies. Silas was not looking at them the way a man looks at children he means to save. He was looking at them the way a man looks at something he wants gone. Silas Crowley left the way he came, high-stepping through the snow on that fine black horse, but the cold he brought with him stayed behind in the house long after the door closed. Caleb stood at the window and watched until horse and rider were nothing but a dark smudge against the white. Then the smudge was gone too, and still he stood there. You didn't give them to him, Martha said. No. Good. She was rocking Rose against her shoulder, patting the little back in slow circles. Because I'll tell you plain, Caleb Hart, if you'd handed those babies to that man, I'd have thrown a skillet at your head. Caleb almost smiled. Almost. He turned from the window and crossed to the fire, easing himself down into the chair. His bones ached. He had not slept right in 2 days, and the freezing water had left a deep chill in him that no fire seemed able to reach. Something's wrong with it, he said. The way he talked, the way he looked at them. You saw it too, then. A man doesn't grieve for children by counting them. Caleb rubbed his hands over his face. He wanted them out of here. Wanted it bad. And a man like Silas Crowley doesn't ride 4 miles through fresh snow for something he doesn't need. Martha lowered herself into the chair across from him, Rose settling into the crook of her arm. The firelight caught the lines of her face, deep and kind, worn soft by 70 years of hard living. They're saying awful things about the mother, she said quietly. Down in town. That she left these 3 out on the ice to die. That she tried to kill Silas. Folks believe it, Caleb. Every word. Do you? Martha was quiet a long moment. She looked down at the sleeping baby in her arms, at the tiny mouth working in a dream. I raised 4 of my own, she said. Buried 2. And I never once in my life met a mother who'd wrap her babies warm, tuck them in a good sturdy basket, and set them where somebody was sure to find them, if what she wanted was for them to die. She shook her head slow. A woman who wanted them dead wouldn't have bothered with the blankets. No. Whoever left these 3 wanted them found. Wanted them living. Caleb stared into the flames. The words settled over him and would not leave. Wanted them living. I've spent a lot of years, he said, and his voice came out rough, keeping myself from feeling anything, telling myself it was safer that way. A man can't lose what he never lets himself have. He looked up at her. I built my whole life around that, around not wanting. And it worked, Martha. It worked fine, right up until I pulled 3 babies out of a creek. And now? Now I've got Samuel curling his fingers in my shirt and Clara looking at me like I hung the moon, and I can't get back behind that wall, no matter how hard I push. His jaw tightened. I don't know how to want something again. Scares me worse than that ice did. But I look at them and I can't do it. I can't turn away from 3 babies who've got nobody. I won't. Martha reached over and laid her weathered hand on his. That's not weakness talking, she said softly. That's your heart waking back up. It hurts because it's alive. Before Caleb could answer, hooves sounded again in the yard. His whole body went tight. But this horse came slower, and the man who dismounted wore a star on his coat. Caleb rose and opened the door. Sheriff Tom Dawson stood on the step, stamping snow from his boots, his hat in his hands. He was a broad, quiet man with a face that gave little away, but his eyes were tired. Caleb, he said with a nod. Martha, mind if I come in? It's a cold night for standing on a porch. Caleb stepped aside. Dawson entered, glanced at the cradle, and something crossed his face that might have been sorrow. I won't keep you long, the sheriff said. But I figured you deserved to hear it straight, not from town gossip. He turned his hat slow in his hands. The children's mother, Eliza Boone. I've got official word now. She's missing. Nobody's seen her in near 2 weeks. And there's charges against her, Caleb. Serious ones. Attempted murder. Abandonment. He drew a breath. Far as the law's concerned right now, she left these 3 to freeze and ran. The room went still. The fire popped. Rose stirred in Martha's arms and settled again. Caleb looked at the sheriff. Then he looked at the cradle, at the 3 small shapes rising and falling with each breath. He thought of Silas Crowley's hungry eyes. He thought of the blankets tucked warm around babies somebody had wanted found. Something hard and steady settled into his chest. The old numbness was gone. What replaced it was clean and sharp as winter air. No, Caleb said. Dawson's brow lifted. No, she didn't run, not from these. Caleb's voice was low, but there was iron in it now. I don't know what happened out there, Tom, but I'm going to find out. And until I do, nobody's taking these babies from this house. Not the law. Not Silas Crowley. Nobody. Morning came pale and cold. The storm had blown itself out in the night, leaving the world buried deep in white and the sky the color of old iron. Caleb was up before the sun. He fed the horses, broke the ice on the trough, and tucked the babies close to Martha, who had stayed the night rather than ride home in the dark. You're going to town, Martha said. It was not a question. I am. To the records office. Caleb pulled his coat tight. If Silas wants these children so bad, there's a reason. Reasons like that get written down somewhere. Land, money, something a man can hold in his hand. He set his hat on his head. I aim to find it. Martha nodded slow. Go on then. We'll be fine here, won't we, Rose? She jostled the baby gently, and Rose gave a soft coo that near broke Caleb's heart on his way out the door. The ride to town took the better part of 2 hours through drifts that came up to his stirrups. The county courthouse sat square in the middle of Main Street, a stern brick building with tall windows fogged white against the cold. Inside, the records clerk was a thin, nervous man named Perkins, who peered at Caleb over a pair of crooked spectacles. Boone, Caleb said. The Boone family land? I want to see the deeds. Perkins hesitated. His eyes flicked toward the window, toward the street, as if somebody might be watching. That's a lot of paper to pull, Mr. Hart. I've got time. The clerk swallowed, then disappeared into the back. He returned with a heavy ledger and set it down like it weighed more than it did. Caleb sat at the long wooden table and began to read. At first, it was plain enough. The Boone place had belonged to the family going back 30 years. Daniel Boone's name was there. Then, after him, Eliza's. Good bottomland along the creek. Water rights that ran the length of the valley. Then Caleb turned a page, and his finger stopped. There was a transfer. Recent. The Boone land, all of it, signed over to Silas Crowley. The date was 3 days before Eliza Boone vanished. Caleb read it twice, then a third time. Perkins, he said quietly. This signature, Eliza's. You see how it sits crooked here? How the letters don't match the ones on the older papers? The clerk would not look. I couldn't say, Mr. Hart. I only file what I'm given. Caleb kept reading. Behind the transfer was a note about the water rights, moved over to Silas the very same day. And then, tucked between the pages, he found something stranger still. A whole section of the record had been torn clean out. The paper edges were fresh and ragged, not yellowed like the rest. Someone had cut a piece of Eliza Boone's history right out of the book. "Who's been in here?" Caleb asked. "Who pulled these files before me?" Perkins went white as the snow outside. His hands trembled on the desk. "I've said too much already," he whispered. "Please, Mr. Hart. Some folks in this county, you don't cross them. You don't." He gathered the ledger up quick, his fingers fumbling. "I think you'd best go now." Caleb rose slow. He looked at the clerk a long moment, at the fear plain on his face, and he understood he'd get nothing more from this man today. But he'd seen enough. It was burned into him now, clear as a brand. He rode home hard, the cold biting at his face, his mind turning over every page he'd read. Martha met him at the door, Samuel fussing in her arms. "Well, what did you find?" Caleb stepped inside and shut the door against the wind. He stood there a moment, hat in his hands, and when he spoke, his voice was low and grim. "Her land's gone, Martha. Signed over to Silas Crowley 3 days before she disappeared. Water rights too." He set his hat down. "And the signature's wrong. Doesn't match her own hand. Somebody forged it, or made her sign it scared." Martha's face went still. "There's more." Caleb's jaw tightened. "A whole piece of the records is torn out, cut clean from the book. Somebody's been in there before me, Martha, tearing up the past." He looked at her, and the words came heavy. Those babies weren't just left. This wasn't a mother running. Somebody planned this. Somebody's been trying to erase Eliza Boone and her whole family right off the map. The next morning broke clear and bitter. Frost sparkled on every fence post like scattered diamonds, and the snow lay so bright under the rising sun that Caleb had to squint against it. He saddled his horse before the coffee had gone cold and rode out toward the creek, the same path he had ridden 2 nights before in the teeth of the storm. He knew the spot the moment he saw it. The ice had thickened again in the cold, sealing over the black water that had nearly swallowed him whole. But he could still see where it had cracked and buckled. Long white scars ran across the surface where his weight had broken through. His own boot prints, half filled with fresh snow, marked the bank where he had dragged himself and the babies to safety. Caleb tied his horse to a bare cottonwood and walked down slow, careful with each step. The basket was still there. He had left it behind that night, too busy carrying 3 lives to think of anything else. Now it sat frozen into the snow at the creek's edge, tipped on its side, one handle poking up like a small dark flag. Caleb crouched down beside it. His breath came out in white clouds. It was a good basket, sturdy, woven tight from willow, the kind a careful hand had made, not the sort of thing a person tossed away without a thought. He ran his fingers along the rim, feeling the smooth places where small hands had gripped it, and something tightened in his chest. Whoever left this had built it to hold 3 babies safe. He worked it loose from the ice, rocking it gentle until it came free. Then he turned it over in his hands, slow, studying every inch the way he had once studied trail sign as an army scout. A bent blade of grass, a broken twig. The smallest thing could tell a whole story if a man knew how to read it. Inside the basket was a thick layer of wool blankets, stiff now with frost. He lifted them out one by one. Beneath them lay a bed of straw, packed close for warmth. Somebody had thought this through. Somebody had wanted these children to last as long as they could against the cold. That was not the work of a mother running scared. That was the work of a mother fighting. Caleb set the blankets aside and ran his hands along the bottom of the basket. His fingers caught on something, a seam in the willow where the weave had been pulled apart and folded back over itself. He pressed at it, and it gave. Tucked into the false bottom, wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth to keep out the wet, was a folded square of paper. His heart began to pound. He worked it free with careful fingers, afraid the cold had made it brittle. But the oilcloth had done its job. The paper unfolded soft and whole in his hands. The writing was small and neat, though it slanted hard toward the end, like the hand that held the pen had been shaking. Caleb read it there in the snow, kneeling by the creek, and the world went quiet around him. To whoever finds them, these are my children. Clara, Samuel, and Rose. I did not leave them because I did not want them. I left them because it was the only way I could think to keep them alive. There are men hunting me who would use my babies to break me. I could not run and carry them both. So I put them here, where a soul with a good heart might find them before the cold took them. Tell them their mother loved them. Tell them I never stopped fighting. If God is kind, I will come back for them. If He is not, then let them grow up knowing this one thing. I never left them, not in my heart. I only tried to keep them alive. Eliza Boone. Caleb's hands trembled. He read it again, and then a third time, the way he had read the crooked signature in the courthouse. But this hand was true. This was a mother's hand. He looked up at the frozen creek, at the scars in the ice, at the small brave basket in the snow. And for the first time in a long time, tears stung his eyes. The letter changed everything. Caleb rode into town 3 days later with Eliza's words folded against his heart like a second skin. The snow had turned to gray slush in the streets, churned up by wagon wheels and horses. He hitched his mount outside the mercantile and stood a moment, watching. The town looked the same as always, but now he saw it different. He saw the way folks lowered their eyes when Silas Crowley's name came up. He saw the fancy sign hanging over the bank, Crowley's name painted gold across the front. He saw it again over the feed store, over the freight office, over the saloon at the end of the street. One man's name, stamped on half the town like a brand burned into cattle. Caleb went inside the mercantile and bought a sack of flour he did not need. "Cold morning," he said to Pete Hollis, who ran the store. "That it is." Pete counted out change with quick fingers. "Been thinking about Eliza Boone?" Caleb said, keeping his voice easy. "The woman who left those babies." Pete's hands went still, just for a second. Then he kept counting. "Don't know nothing about that," Pete said. "You knew her, though. Her land ain't half a mile from your back door." "Knew her to nod at?" Pete slid the change across the counter and turned away to stack cans that did not need stacking. "Best leave that be, Caleb. Some things ain't worth digging into." Caleb picked up his flour and left, but he had seen the fear in the man's eyes, plain as a track in fresh mud. It was the same everywhere he went. At the livery, old Sam Cutter admitted he owed Silas near $200 and could not pay. "He lets it ride," Sam said quietly, brushing down a bay mare. "Long as I keep my mouth shut and vote how he tells me. That's how it works around here. You owe him. You belong to him." At the freight office, the clerk turned white when Caleb mentioned Eliza and pretended he had customers waiting. There were none. Caleb began to understand. Silas Crowley did not rule the valley with a gun. He ruled it with debt, with favors, with the quiet threat that lived behind every friendly handshake. He held the notes on half the farms in the county. He owned the store where folks bought their seed, and the bank where they kept their savings, and the freight line that carried their crops to market. Cross him, and a man could lose everything overnight. No wonder they were afraid. Caleb spent his evenings at Martha's kitchen table, laying out what he had found while she poured coffee and listened. The babies slept in a crib she had borrowed from a neighbor, Clara and Samuel and Rose bundled together like puppies. "He's got his hand on every throat in this valley," Caleb said. "Squeeze one, and the rest go quiet." Martha nodded slow. "I've watched it happen for years. Watched good people turn their heads because speaking up costs too much." She set the pot down hard. "I'm ashamed to say I was one of them." It was a widow named Ruth Carver who finally cracked the door open. She came to Martha's late one night, wrapped in a shawl, her eyes darting to the windows. "I heard you've been asking," Ruth whispered. "About Eliza." Caleb leaned forward. "I have." Ruth twisted her hands together. "I was in the mercantile the day Silas came for her. Heard him with my own ears. Told her if she didn't sign over that land, he'd see her children taken and her name ruined. Said he'd make sure no soul in the county would speak for her." Ruth's voice shook. She didn't back down. She spit right in his face. "Would you say that to a judge?" Caleb asked. Ruth's face crumpled. "I can't. He holds the note on my farm. I got 3 young ones of my own. If I speak, he'll put us out in the snow." Over the next week, 2 more came quiet in the night. A blacksmith, a young mother. Both told the same story. Silas had threatened Eliza. Silas had lied. And every one of them begged Caleb not to use their name. The truth was there. He could feel the shape of it now, solid and real. But truth in the dark helped no one. Someone had to be brave enough to carry it into the light. The Boone farmhouse sat quiet under a gray sky, its windows dark, like the eyes of something that had given up. Caleb reined in at the broken gate and looked it over. The place had been fine once. He could see that. The barn was solid. The fences ran straight. But now snow drifted up against the porch, and the front door hung open, swinging soft in the wind. Nobody had cared for this land in weeks. Martha climbed down from the wagon behind him. Ruth Carver came with her, and 2 others. A tall woman named Betsy, who ran the boarding house. A younger one, Anna, with a baby of her own, bundled at home. They had all come quiet in the early gray light before the town was awake to see. "You sure about this?" Betsy asked, hugging her coat tight. "No," Martha said, "but I'm doing it anyway. That's how brave works." They went inside together. The cold hit them first. The house was as cold as the yard. Colder, maybe, the way empty houses always are. Caleb stepped careful across the floorboards. A layer of dust lay over everything, but here and there he saw signs of a life stopped in the middle. A cradle stood in the front room. 3 small blankets folded neat on a chair beside it. "She had them right here," Anna whispered. "All 3. Caleb moved through the house slow, reading it the way he used to read ground. In the kitchen, he found a table set for a meal that was never eaten. 2 jars of preserves sat open, half spooned out. A pot still hung over a cold fireplace, the food inside gone hard and gray. But it was the corner by the back door that stopped him. A carpet bag sat there, packed and waiting. He knelt and opened it. Inside were baby clothes, folded careful, little knitted things, a tin of crackers, a wrapped bundle of dried meat, a change of clothes for a grown woman. "Martha," he said, "come look at this." Martha came and stood over his shoulder. She went quiet. "She packed to leave," Caleb said. "Packed for the road, food, clothes for the young ones." He lifted a tiny wool cap and turned it in his hands. "A woman who means to abandon her babies doesn't pack their winter caps." Martha pressed a hand to her mouth. She was running with them, all of them. Something stopped her before she could go. Ruth stood in the doorway, and her eyes filled up. "They told us she left them cold, told us she didn't want them." Her voice broke. "It was a lie. It was all a lie." Caleb set the cap down gentle, like it might break. Somebody came before she could get out. She had to change her plan fast, had to hide them where they'd be found. His jaw tightened. She never left them behind. She left them where they might live. The women spread out through the house then, and they searched with new fire in them. Betsy checked the cupboards. Anna went through a trunk in the bedroom. Ruth ran her hands along the mantel and the window ledges. "Look for anything she might have written," Caleb said. "A woman fighting alone leaves a trail. She'd want somebody to know the truth." They worked for the better part of an hour. Caleb pried up a loose brick by the hearth and found nothing but cold ash. Betsy tapped along the walls, listening for hollows. It was Martha who found it. She was in the small bedroom at the back, down on her knees, her breath fogging in the cold air. She had pulled back an old braided rug, worn thin from years of feet. Beneath it, the floorboards did not sit right. One of them rocked when she pressed it, then another. "Caleb!" Her voice was low and sharp. "Caleb, come quick." He crossed the room in 3 steps and dropped down beside her. Together they worked their fingers into the gap and lifted. The boards came up with a dry creak. There, tucked in the dark hollow beneath the floor, wrapped in a square of oilcloth to keep out the damp, lay a small leather book. Eliza's journal. Night came down hard over Caleb's ranch, but inside the house the fire burned warm and steady. The women gathered close around it, their chairs pulled in a rough circle. The babies slept in the next room, watched over by Anna, who peeked in on them now and then. Caleb held the journal in his hands. The leather was soft from handling. Somebody had opened this book many times. "Go on," Martha said quiet. "Read it out loud. She'd want us to hear her." Caleb opened to the first page. Eliza's writing was small and neat, the letters careful, like she'd learned to write from someone who cared about doing things right. He cleared his throat and began. October 3rd, Mr. Crowley came again today. He sat on my porch like he owned it and drank my coffee and told me my land was too much for a woman alone. He offered me money, not near what it's worth. I told him no. He smiled the whole time. I did not like that smile. The fire popped. Nobody moved. Caleb turned the page. October 12th, he came back with papers, said all I had to do was sign, said a woman with 3 mouths to feed can't be choosy. I told him again, no, this is my father's land. This is Daniel Boone's land, and it stays with his blood. Ruth drew a sharp breath at the name. Daniel Boone, she whispered. That was her father? Caleb's jaw went tight. He did not look up. Keep listening, he said. October 20th. Something in him changed today. The smile is gone now. He said if I would not think of myself, I ought to think of my children. He said children need a mother who can provide. He said it would be a shame if the county decided I was not fit. My hand shook after he left. I know a threat when I hear one dressed up nice. Betsy pressed her lips together. That devil, she said low. He was threatening her babies, right to her face. Martha reached over and squeezed the younger woman's hand. Caleb read on, his voice steady even as the words grew darker. November 2nd. 2 men rode by the fence line today, just watching. They did not wave. They did not speak. They only sat their horses and looked at my house until the sun went down. I brought the children inside and barred the door. I did not sleep. He turned another page. His thumb lingered on the paper. November 8th. I am not sleeping now. I hear them at night out past the barn. I know what Crowley wants. It took me long enough to see it plain, but I see it now and it is worse than I thought. Caleb stopped. His eyes moved down the page and something changed in his face. Martha leaned forward. What is it? She asked. What does it say? Caleb read slow, careful, like each word carried weight. It was never really about my land, not the fields, not the barn. It is about the creek. My creek. The water comes down from the high country and crosses my property before it reaches the whole valley below. Every ranch, every farm, every family down there drinks from it, waters their stock from it, grows their food with it. The room had gone dead silent. Even the fire seemed to hush. If Crowley owns my land, he owns the water, and if he owns the water, he owns every soul in this valley. He can raise the price or shut it off whenever he pleases. He can make good people beg. That is what he is after. Not one farm. All of them. He wants to hold the whole valley in his fist, and my land is the key that turns the lock. Caleb lowered the book. His hand was not quite steady. That's why, he said. That's why he needed her gone. Why he needed the town believing she ran off. He looked around the circle at the pale faces lit by the fire. This was never just about Eliza. Never just about 3 babies on the ice. Martha's voice came soft and certain. It's about all of us, she said. Morning came gray and cold, but Martha Whitaker was already up and moving before the sun cleared the ridge. She had coffee on the stove and a plan in her head, and when Martha had both of those things at once, there was no stopping her. Caleb, she said, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders. Hitch the wagon. We're going to town. Caleb looked up from the fire. What for? Martha's eyes were steady and bright. Because this valley has been holding its breath for years, and it's high time somebody let it out. They rode into town under a sky the color of old iron. Martha did not go to the sheriff first. She did not go to the church. She went to the places where women gathered, the general store, the washing well, the little kitchen behind the boarding house where Ruth kept a pot of soup going all day long. She knocked on doors. She sat at tables. She spoke plain and low, and she let the women speak too. At first, they were afraid. Caleb could see it in the way their hands worked their aprons, in the way their eyes darted to the window, like Silas himself might be standing outside. He holds my husband's note, one woman whispered. If I say a word against him, he'll take our farm. He set the price on my flour so high last winter my children went hungry, said another. But what can we do? He owns the mill. He owns everything. Martha listened to all of it. Then she set her coffee cup down hard on the table. He owns what we let him own, she said, and I am done letting. Something shifted in that little kitchen. Caleb watched it happen, slow at first, like ice breaking on a pond in spring. One woman spoke, then another. The fear was still there, but underneath it, something older and stronger was waking up. Betsy stood in the corner, arms crossed. My cousin worked the county office, she said suddenly. Her voice shook, but she kept going. She told me once that Crowley came in late at night and had her burn papers, land records. She never knew why. She was too scared to ask. Betsy swallowed. She quit right after, moved to her sister's place, but she'd talk. If somebody asked her right, she'd talk. Ruth wiped her hands on her apron. The banker's wife owes me a kindness, she said. I nursed her boy through the fever 2 winters back. She hears things her husband says, things about who owes what and who's about to lose their place. She lifted her chin. I'll go to her today. An old woman named Hazel, who had not said a word the whole time, finally spoke from her chair by the window. Her voice was thin, but sure. My Henry saw Crowley's men riding out toward the Boone place back in November, she said. He was too scared to say anything then. He's gone now, God rest him. But I'm not scared anymore. I'm 71 years old, and I've got nothing left for that man to take. She folded her hands in her lap. You write down what I know. All of it. By noon, the little kitchen was full. Women came and went, and each one carried a piece of the truth. A witness here, a memory there, a name, a date, a moment somebody had seen and buried deep out of fear. Martha sat at the head of the table with a stack of paper and a pencil, writing it all down in her careful hand. The pile grew. Each page was a small thing on its own, but together they were beginning to look like something a judge could not ignore. Caleb stood by the wall, watching. His throat felt tight. For years he had carried his burdens alone. He had believed that was the only way. that help was for other men, and that he deserved to stand by himself in the dark. But here, in this warm kitchen full of ordinary women finding their courage, he understood something he had forgotten. He was not alone. He had never been meant to fight this alone. Martha looked up from her writing and met his eyes across the room. She gave him a small nod. "You see it now?" she said, quiet. Caleb nodded back. His voice came rough. "I see it," he said. The days that followed were unlike anything Caleb had known in years. His ranch, once so quiet, a man could hear his own heartbeat, filled with life. It started small. Ruth came with a basket of fresh bread and stayed to help wash the baby's things. Then Betsy arrived with a bundle of soft cloth for diapers. By the end of the week, there was rarely a moment when someone was not knocking at his door. The women came in a steady stream. They brought milk and blankets. They brought pots of stew that filled the whole house with a rich, warm smell. They brought their own children, too, and soon the ranch echoed with sounds Caleb had almost forgotten. Little feet running across the floorboards, laughter spilling out the windows, the soft cooing of women bent over the cradles, whispering to Clara, Samuel, and Rose. Caleb did not know how to act at first. He hovered at the edges, stiff and unsure, like a man standing outside a warm fire he was not certain he was allowed to join. But the babies did not let him stay away. Rose was the one who reached him first. One afternoon, as Caleb passed her cradle, her tiny hand shot out and grabbed his rough finger. She held tight, her small fist wrapped around him like she would never let go. She looked up at him with eyes so wide and trusting that something in his chest cracked clean open. He sat down beside her. He did not get up for a long while. After that, it came easier. He learned how to hold Samuel against his shoulder when the boy fussed at night. He learned that Clara liked to be rocked slow and steady, and that if you hummed low in your throat, she would drift off to sleep. He learned the weight of them in his arms, the smell of their hair, the way their little chests rose and fell. Martha watched all of it with a knowing smile she tried to hide behind her coffee cup. "You're getting good at that," she said one morning, nodding toward the way Caleb balanced Rose on his hip while he stirred the fire. Caleb almost smiled. "I'm just doing what needs doing." "Sure you are," Martha said. The whole valley seemed different now. Word of what the women were building had spread, and hope had a way of pulling people in. Men who had once looked away now tipped their hats when they passed the ranch. A farmer left a sack of grain by the barn without a word. Children left small carved toys on the porch step. The Boone triplets had become the valley's own, and in caring for them, the people were remembering how to care for one another. Caleb felt the change, most of all inside himself. The heavy stone he had carried in his chest for so long was still there, but it had grown lighter somehow. Warmer, like the sun had finally reached a part of him that had been frozen through for years. One quiet evening, after the last neighbor had gone home and the children were asleep, Caleb and Martha sat by the fire. The house was still, but it was a good kind of still now. A full kind. The cradles rested nearby, and the soft sound of 3 babies breathing filled the room. Caleb stared into the flames for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "Martha," he said, "can I tell you something?" She set down her mending. "Always." Caleb was quiet a moment more. His eyes drifted to the cradles, then back to the fire. "For years I woke up, and I couldn't think of one reason to get out of bed," he said. "I did my chores because a man has to. I fed the animals. I mended the fences. But it was just moving through the days, waiting for them to end." He swallowed hard. "I didn't have a reason. Not one." Martha waited, letting him find his words. "Now I do," Caleb said. His voice broke just a little. "Those 3 little ones in there, They gave it back to me. That thing I lost. He pressed his hand to his chest. Purpose. A reason. He looked at Martha, and for the first time, in longer than he could remember, there was light in his eyes. I can see it again, he said softly. A future. I never thought I'd say that, but I can. I can see it. The morning of the hearing dawned cold and gray. A thin frost covered the ground, but the sky held no more snow. It was as if the whole valley had gone still, waiting to see what would come. Caleb rose before dawn. He fed the animals in the dark, his breath clouding the air. When he came back inside, Martha had already dressed the babies in their warmest clothes. Ruth had come early to mind them during the hearing. You look like a man ready for war, Martha said, handing him his coat. Feels like it, Caleb answered. They rode into town together in Martha's old wagon. Caleb held Eliza's journal, wrapped tight in oilcloth against his chest, as if it might blow away. Inside those pages was the truth. A mother's own words, her fear, her love, her fight. The town courthouse was packed. Caleb had never seen so many people gathered inside those walls. Farmers stood shoulder to shoulder with shopkeepers. Ranch wives filled the benches, their faces set and firm. These were the same people who had once looked away. Now they had come to stand. Silas Crowley sat in the front, dressed fine as always. His silver hair was combed neat. His hands were folded like a man without a worry in the world. But Caleb saw it the moment their eyes met. Something behind Silas's smile had gone tight. The judge was a lean man with gray whiskers and sharp eyes. He rapped his knuckles on the table, and the room fell quiet. We're here about the matter of Eliza Boone, the judge said. There are those who wish to speak. Let them come forward. Caleb stood. His boots sounded loud on the wooden floor as he walked to the front. He set the journal on the judge's table with steady hands. This belonged to Eliza Boone, Caleb said. His voice carried through the whole room. She wrote it herself. It tells what really happened. She never abandoned those babies. She was fighting to keep them alive. The judge opened the journal. He read in silence. The room held its breath. Then Martha rose. I found it myself, Your Honor, hidden under the floorboards of her farmhouse, along with these good women here who searched with me. She swept her hand toward the benches, and a dozen women stood. One by one they spoke. Ruth told how records had gone missing from the county office. Betsy told how witnesses had changed their stories after Silas paid them visits. An old farmer stood, his hat crushed in his hands, and admitted he had seen Silas's men riding toward the Boone land the very night Eliza vanished. With each voice, Silas shifted in his seat. His folded hands came apart. His jaw grew tight. The confident mask he wore began to slip, one crack at a time. This is nonsense, Silas finally said, rising to his feet. The word of a widow woman and a broken rancher? That journal could have been written by anyone. The land transfer papers weren't written by anyone, Caleb said. He pulled out another folded sheet. They show Eliza's land became yours 3 days before she disappeared. 3 days, Silas. You took it before she was even gone. The room stirred. Whispers ran through the benches like wind through grass. Silas's face went red. You don't know what you're talking about. I know a mother left her babies where they'd be found, Caleb said quietly, because she knew she couldn't protect them and fight you at the same time. That's not a woman who ran. That's a woman who gave everything she had. The judge closed the journal slow. He looked at Silas for a long, hard moment. Then he looked out over the crowded room at the faces that had finally chosen to speak. I have heard enough, the judge said. His voice was firm. There is more than enough here to warrant a full investigation into Silas Crowley and the matter of the Boone land. He turned toward the benches. And as for Eliza Boone, based on her own words and the testimony given today, I see no woman guilty of abandonment. I see a mother wronged. Her name will be cleared. A sound rose up from the crowd. It started low, then swelled into cheers and weeping and clapping hands. Martha grabbed Caleb's arm and held tight, tears shining on her cheeks. Justice, at long last, had come. The day after the hearing, the ranch woke to sunlight. Caleb had not slept much. His mind kept turning over the words the judge had spoken. Her name will be cleared. He had waited so long to hear something set right that now the quiet of morning felt almost too good to be real. He rose with the sun and did not fight it. For once, the work ahead did not feel like a burden. It felt like a beginning. He started in the small back room. Years ago, it had been a nursery. Caleb had shut the door on it long before, and he had not opened it since. Dust lay thick over everything. A wooden cradle sat in the corner, half hidden under a sheet, gone yellow with time. Caleb stood in the doorway for a long moment. His hand rested on the frame. Then he stepped inside. He pulled the sheet away. Beneath it was the cradle he had built with his own hands years ago, for a daughter who never got to grow. The wood was still smooth. His fingers traced the little carvings along the edge, small stars he had cut late at night while his wife slept. His chest ached, but it was not the old ache. This one had something soft folded inside it. "Reckon you'd want them to use it?" he said quietly. "To no one and to everyone." He carried the cradle out to the main room and set it near the fire. Then he went back for more. He swept the floors. He patched a hole in the wall where the wind had crept through. He fixed the loose board on the step so no small foot would ever catch on it. Martha came by around midday with the babies bundled in her arms. Ruth followed behind her. "Look at you," Martha said, glancing around the cleaned room. "Busy as a bee." Caleb took little Rose from her and held the baby against his shoulder. The child made a soft sound and settled at once. "Wanted it ready," Caleb said. "For them. For however long they need it." Martha's eyes went soft. "You're dreaming again, Caleb Hart. I can see it plain on your face." He did not deny it. For the first time in years, he let himself think of the days ahead. He pictured 3 little ones running through the yard come summer. He pictured teaching Samuel to ride. He pictured Clara and Rose chasing each other through the tall grass. He pictured a house that was full again, a house that was loud with living. It was a dangerous thing, hope. Caleb knew that better than most, but he let it in anyway. That afternoon, a rider came up the road. Caleb saw the dust first, then the horse, then the man, dressed in a dark coat, carrying papers in a leather case. He was not from town. Caleb knew the look of a lawyer when he saw one. "Mr. Hart?" the man said, not climbing down. "I've come from the county on behalf of Mr. Silas Crowley." Caleb's jaw went tight. "The man's got no business here." "He has legal business, sir." The lawyer opened his case and drew out a paper heavy with official seals. "It concerns the children in your care." The bottom fell out of Caleb's stomach. "The children have no living guardian named by the court," the man went on, his voice flat as stone. "You are not their kin. You share no blood. Under the law, you have no claim to keep them. Until a proper guardian is found through the courts, the children will be placed elsewhere for safekeeping." "Their mother's alive," Caleb said. His voice shook. "Her name's cleared. She'll come for them. When Mrs. Boone appears before the court and her custody is confirmed, that will be considered. Until then, the order stands." The man held out the paper. "The children are to be removed today." Caleb did not take it. He looked back at the house. Through the window, he could see Martha holding Samuel, her face gone pale. There was nothing he could do. The law was the law, and this time it stood against him. They took the babies before the sun went down. Caleb stood in the yard and watched the wagon shrink down the road until it was gone. Then he walked back inside. The cradle sat by the fire, empty. The house was silent, so silent. And in that silence, the old grief came creeping back, cold as the creek that had started it all. Morning came again, but Caleb did not rise with it. He sat in the chair by the fire, though the fire had gone cold hours ago. Gray ash filled the hearth. The room was still. Too still. The empty cradle sat where he had left it, and he could not bring himself to look at it. Nor could he look away. The cows needed feeding. The horses needed water. Somewhere out in the frost, the fences waited to be checked. Caleb knew all of it. He had done the work every morning of his life, storm or shine, grief or joy. It had always saved him before. Keep the hands busy, and the heart cannot sink too far. But this morning, his hands would not move. He stared at the floor he had swept clean 2 days ago. He remembered how he had patched the wall so no wind could reach the babies. He had fixed the loose board so no small foot would catch. He had built a whole world for 3 little ones, and then the world had come and taken them anyway. Fool, he said aloud. The word scraped out of him. Old fool. That was the truth of it. He had known better. He had known that hope was a dangerous thing, a thing that opened you up so the world could get its knife in deeper. He had lost his wife. He had lost his daughter. He had lost Daniel. And still he had let himself dream of a house full of children. Still he had built a cradle up from the dust. He should have known. Every person he had ever loved, life had found a way to pull from his arms. Maybe some men were made for that. Maybe the wanting itself was the sin, and the losing was the price. He did not eat. He did not stir. The sun climbed the window and slid across the floor. And Caleb sat in the middle of it like a stone in a river, letting the day pass around him. He did not hear the wagon. He did not hear the door. He heard Martha's voice. "Well," she said, standing in the doorway with her hands on her hips. "The stock's all bawling their heads off, and here you sit." Caleb did not look up. "Go home, Martha." "I will not." She stepped inside. Her boots were loud on the clean floor. She took one look at the cold hearth, the untouched food, the man slumped in the chair, and her face changed, softened, then hardened again with something like fire. So, this is it. This is where Caleb Hart lays down. There's nothing left to stand up for. Nothing. Martha said the word like it tasted bad. She crossed the room and stood right in front of him, so he had no choice but to see her worn boots, the hem of her dress dark with frost. "Those 3 babies are out there in a stranger's house this morning, and you're telling me there's nothing to stand up for? The law's against me. You saw it. You were here." His voice cracked. "I've got no blood claim, no standing. I'm just the man who pulled them off the ice. That's all I ever was to them. That's a lie, and you know it." Martha knelt down, slow on her old knees, until she was looking straight into his eyes. "You listen to me, Caleb. I've buried a husband. I know what grief does. It comes in whispering that love is too dear a thing to hold, that you'd be safer with your hands empty." She reached out and took one of his hands in both of hers. But love was never meant to be safe. Love takes courage. It's the bravest thing a body can do, to keep on loving when life keeps teaching you to stop. Caleb's eyes burned. He looked away, but she squeezed his hand until he looked back. "You didn't jump into that creek because it was safe," she said. "You jumped because those children needed you. They need you still. And Eliza's out there needing you too. You gonna sit here in the cold, or you gonna get up and fight for them?" The fire was gone from the hearth, but something kindled behind Caleb's ribs. Slowly he sat up. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. "No," he said, and his voice was steadier now. "No, I'm not done." He pulled in a long breath. "I'm not giving them up. Not while there's breath in me." Martha smiled, and her eyes shone. "There he is." Caleb rose to his feet. The Boone farmhouse looked lonelier than ever in the pale morning light. Frost clung to the windows. The porch sagged under a thin blanket of snow. Caleb reined in his horse and sat for a moment, just looking at the place. It had the sad, hollow feel of a home that had been left in a hurry. A shutter hung crooked on one hinge, swinging a little in the wind. A child's small wooden horse lay half buried near the steps, forgotten. Martha climbed down from the wagon with a grunt. "Well," she said, brushing off her skirts, "let's see what secrets this old house has left to give up." Inside, the cold was worse. Their breath hung in the air. Caleb lit the lamp he had brought, and the yellow light pushed back the gloom. Dust lay thick on the table. A tin cup still sat by the wash basin, waiting for hands that had not come back. Caleb set the journal down on the table. They had read it a dozen times already. But Martha had a saying that a person never sees everything the first time, or the second, and Caleb had come to trust her sayings. He turned the pages slow. Eliza's handwriting was neat and small, the letters pressed hard into the paper, as if she had been afraid the words might fade. He read about the threats, the visits from Silas Crowley's men, the nights she had lain awake, listening for the sound of horses. "Here," Caleb said. He tapped a page near the back. "She keeps writing about the hearth, 3 times. The stones hold what matters. Behind the stones." I thought she meant she was cold, but she wasn't writing about being cold. Martha came to stand beside him. She looked at the words, then at the fireplace across the room. Her eyes narrowed. "A woman doesn't write the same thing 3 times unless she's trying to be heard," she said. They crossed to the hearth together. Caleb knelt on the cold stone and ran his hands along the rough face of it. The stones were fitted tight, gray and heavy, set by hands long dead. He pressed each one. He pushed. He pulled. Nothing moved. Martha held the lamp closer. "There," she said. "That one on the left. The mortar's different. Newer." Caleb saw it too. Around one flat stone, the pale gray dust of old mortar gave way to a darker line, packed in by hand. Recent. He drew his knife and worked the blade around the edge. Bit by bit, the dark mortar crumbled away. He worked patient, careful, the way he did everything, until at last the stone shifted. He set his fingers in the crack and pulled. The stone came loose with a low grinding sound and slid free. Behind it was a hollow hidden in the dark heart of the chimney. Caleb reached in. His hand closed on something wrapped in oilcloth. He drew it out slow. Inside the cloth was a folded letter, sealed and tied with a bit of string. On the front, in that same neat, hard-pressed hand, were 2 words. "To whoever finds them." Caleb's breath caught. His fingers trembled as he untied the string. Martha lowered herself onto the hearthstone beside him, the lamp shaking a little in her grip. "Go on," she whispered. "Read it." Caleb unfolded the paper. The words swam for a moment, and he blinked to clear them. "If you are reading this, then my children were found, and I thank God for it. I did not leave them because I did not want them. I left them where they would be seen, where a kind soul might find them before the cold could. It was the only way. Silas Crowley's men were hunting me, and as long as they hunted me, my babies were in danger. So I drew them away. I went north to the old trapper's cabin above Miller's Bend, where my father used to take me. I am gathering proof of what Silas has done. If I do not come back, know that I never stopped fighting for them. A mother does not abandon her children. She only does what she must to keep them alive." Caleb read it twice. Then he lowered the letter and looked at Martha, and his eyes were wet. "She's alive," he said, "and I know where she is." The morning broke cold and gray over the mountains. Caleb was in the saddle before the sun cleared the ridge. He had slept little. Eliza's letter was folded inside his coat, close to his heart, and every mile he rode, he felt the weight of it there. Miller's Bend lay to the north, a hard climb through pine and stone, and the snow had come deep in the high country. But Caleb Hart had scouted worse ground than this in his army days, and he did not turn back for cold. The trail narrowed as he climbed. His horse picked its way careful over rock and root, breath steaming in the thin air. Frost hung heavy on the branches, bending them low. The whole world was white and silent, save for the crunch of hooves and the far-off cry of a hawk. Caleb kept his eyes moving. He read the land the way another man might read a book. A broken branch here, a faint dent in the snow there, near filled in, but not quite. Someone had come this way once, a long time ago now, but the mountains held their secrets slow. He found the first cabin near midday. It sat crooked against a hillside, half swallowed by drifts. The door hung open, banging soft in the wind. Caleb dismounted and drew his rifle, though he did not think he would need it. He stepped inside. Empty, cold as a grave, a rusted stove, a collapsed cot. No sign that anyone had sheltered here in years. Caleb's chest tightened. He climbed back into the saddle and rode on. The second cabin was worse. Half the roof had fallen in. Snow lay in a heap on the dirt floor where the ceiling had given way. Caleb stood in the doorway a long moment, and a cold thought crept into him. What if the letter was old? What if Eliza had come and gone, or worse? What if he was chasing a ghost through the snow, the way he had chased ghosts his whole life? He shook the thought loose. He would not do that. Not this time. Miller's Bend, he said aloud to no one. The old trapper's cabin, where her father took her. He remembered something then. Daniel Boone, sitting by a fire 20 years gone, talking of a mining claim his family once held. A cabin above the bend, he'd said, where a man could disappear if he had a mind to. Caleb had near forgotten it, but the mind holds things it does not know it keeps. He turned his horse east, off the main trail, following the sound of running water. The creek would lead him to the bend, and above the bend, if his memory held true, the old mine. The light was fading when he found it. The cabin sat tucked in a fold of the mountain, hidden from below by a stand of dark pines. The mouth of an old mine yawned black behind it. Smoke, thin and gray, curled from the chimney. Smoke. Someone was here. Caleb was off his horse before it fully stopped. He crossed the snow in long strides, heart hammering. He reached the doors and pushed it open. Eliza? For a moment, he saw nothing but shadow. Then the fire's low light showed her. She lay against the far wall, wrapped in a ragged blanket, her face pale as the snow outside. Her leg was bound in a splint of cut branches and torn cloth, dark with old blood. She was thin, too thin, but her eyes opened at the sound of his voice, and they were sharp still, sharp and afraid. "Stay back," she rasped. Her hand moved toward a knife on the floor beside her. Caleb raised both palms and stopped where he stood. "Easy now. I'm a friend. Your father's friend. Caleb Hart." The name struck her like a physical thing. Her hand went still. Her eyes searched his face, disbelieving. "Caleb Hart," she whispered. "My father spoke of you." He did. Caleb knelt slow, keeping his distance. "Eliza, your babies are safe, all 3 of them. I pulled them from the creek myself. They're warm and fed and safe at my ranch." A sound broke from her then, half sob, half prayer. Tears spilled down her thin cheeks. "You found them." Her voice shook. "You found them. I never left them, Mr. Hart. I swear before God I never left them. I only tried to keep them alive. I know, Caleb said softly. I read your letter. I know everything now. He moved to her side, and this time she did not reach for the knife. The road down the mountain was slow and hard, but they made it before the second dark fell. Caleb had wrapped Eliza in every blanket he carried and held her steady against him on the horse. Martha met them at the edge of town with a wagon and warm bricks, clucking like a hen and shooing men aside. By morning, Eliza lay in a soft bed in Martha's front room, her leg cleaned and set proper, color slowly returning to her cheeks. It was afternoon before she was strong enough to talk. Sheriff Dawson stood by the window, hat in his hands. Martha sat close, a bowl of broth ready. Caleb pulled a chair beside the bed and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Take your time, he said. No one here means you harm. Eliza's fingers curled into the quilt. Her voice came thin at first, then grew stronger as the words spilled out, as if they had been trapped inside her too long. It started with the water, she said. My family's land sits on the high creek. Whoever holds it holds the water for half the valley. My father knew that. He always said the land was worth more than gold to a man like Silas Crowley. Dawson's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Silas came to me kind at first, Eliza went on. Offered to buy. When I said no, the offers turned to threats. He said a widow woman with 3 babies had no business trying to run a claim alone. He said accidents happen to folks who don't listen. Martha muttered something under her breath. Eliza gave her a weak, grateful smile. I started watching him. Careful. I found out he'd been buying up debts all over the county, squeezing families off their land one by one. I found the papers where he planned to dam the creek and sell water back to the very people he'd ruined. She swallowed hard. I wrote it all down. I gathered proof. I meant to bring it to the law. Why didn't you? Dawson asked, though his voice was gentle. Because Silas owned the law. Her eyes flicked to him, wary. No offense meant, Sheriff, but before you came, there were men in this town who wore a badge and took his money both. Dawson gave a slow nod. None taken. I know what came before me. Eliza pulled in a shaky breath. He found out what I knew. That's when his men came. 3 of them, on horseback, in the dead of night. I heard them before I saw them. I had time to grab the babies and run for the high trail. My father always told me if trouble came, run for Miller's Bend, the old cabin, where a body could disappear. Her hands were trembling now. Caleb reached out and laid his rough hand over hers, and she gripped it tight. The trail was ice. My horse went down on the switchback. I felt my legs snap when I fell. Tears stood in her eyes. I knew I couldn't carry 3 babies up that mountain with a broken leg. I knew if I stayed on the trail, Silas's men would find us, and there'd be no one left to tell the truth. So I did the only thing I could think of. The creek, Caleb said softly. She nodded, and the tears fell freely now. I set them in the basket where the ice was thick, where folks crossed to the church road, where someone was sure to find them come morning. I carved my words beneath so no one would ever call me a mother who threw her babies away. Then I dragged myself up the mountain and hid, praying God would send someone kind before the cold took them. Her voice broke. He sent you. The room was quiet a long moment, only the fire crackled. Then Eliza looked up at Caleb, and something changed in her face, a softness mixed with an old grief. You should know something, she said, about my father. Caleb went still. He didn't die the way you were told, not in battle, not far off in some army fight. She held his gaze steady. He died here, on our land, years back when Silas first came sniffing after the water. Caleb's breath caught in his chest. What? Silas sent men after us even then. I was young, But I remember. My father stood in the doorway with his rifle and told me to run out the back with my mother. Her voice trembled, but did not break. He held them off. He gave us the minutes we needed. They shot him down on his own porch, Mr. Hart. He died protecting me. The words landed in Caleb like a stone dropped in still water, and everything inside him went quiet. For 20 years, he had carried the belief that he had failed Daniel Boone, that his old friend had died alone in some far place while Caleb lived on. He had built a wall of guilt around his heart, brick by brick, certain he had broken his promise the day Daniel breathed his last. But it was not so. Daniel had not died waiting for a rescue that never came. He had died the way a good man dies, on his feet, in front of his child, choosing love over his own life. Caleb bowed his head, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, the tears came without shame. "He never blamed you," Eliza whispered. "How could he? You couldn't have known." "No," Caleb said, his voice thick. "I couldn't have." And in that small warm room, with the fire burning low and the snow falling soft outside, the guilt he had carried so long began at last to melt away. The courthouse had never been so full. Folks packed the wooden benches shoulder to shoulder, ranch wives in their Sunday shawls, shopkeepers who had not closed their doors for anything in years, farmers with hats crushed in nervous hands. They had come from every corner of the valley, and the air was thick with the smell of wet wool and wood smoke and something else, something Caleb had not felt in that town for a long, long time. Courage. Eliza sat at the front, her broken leg propped and wrapped, her chin held high. Caleb sat beside her, steady as stone. Martha was just behind, and next to her, a whole row of women who had once stayed silent. Now they leaned forward, waiting. Judge Harmon banged his gavel. The room went quiet. Silas Crowley sat across the aisle in a fine black coat, looking as calm as a man at Sunday dinner. He smiled at the judge. He smiled at the crowd. He had bought his way out of trouble 100 times before, and he had every reason to believe today would be no different. But today was different. Sheriff Dawson stood first. He laid Eliza's journal on the table before the judge, along with the folded letter and the deed papers she had hidden beneath the floorboards. "Your Honor," Dawson said, "these were written in Eliza Boone's own hand, long before any accusation was ever made against her. They tell of threats, of debts bought up to squeeze folks off their land, and of a plan to dam the High Creek and sell water back to the very families Silas Crowley ruined." A murmur rolled through the crowd. Silas rose smoothly. "Your Honor, a desperate woman will write all manner of wild things. This is the scribbling of someone trying to save her own skin after she abandoned 3 helpless babies on the ice." "I did not abandon them," Eliza said. Her voice cut clean across the room. Every head turned. "I left them where they would be found, where they would live, because your men were coming to kill us all." She held his gaze without blinking. "I carved my words beneath that basket." "Read them, Judge." A woman throwing her babies away does not leave a message begging the world to remember she loved them. The judge lifted the small carved plank Caleb had pried loose from the basket. He read the words aloud, slow and clear. "If they find my children, tell them I never left them. I was trying to keep them alive." The courtroom fell so still, you could hear the fire pop in the stove. Silas's smile flickered, just for a breath, but Caleb saw it. "Papers can be forged," Silas said, quicker now. "Anyone might carve a lie into wood." "Then explain the deed," Dawson said. He held up the transfer papers. "Eliza Boone's land was signed over to you 3 days before she disappeared. 3 days. Yet she was here, running from your men with a broken leg and 3 newborns. Tell this court how a woman on the run found time to sign away her family's land, Mr. Crowley." Silas opened his mouth. Nothing came. "And these debts," Dawson pressed on, pulling out ledger after ledger. Bought quiet, all over the county. The Hensons, the Palmers, the Coles. Every one of them chased off land that sits along the High Creek. Every one of them, Your Honor. Now the crowd was rising, not with anger alone, but with something braver. One by one, folks who had lost their homes stood to their feet. "He took my farm," an old man called out. "And mine," said a woman near the back. "He threatened my boy," another shouted. Silas turned, his face gone pale, looking for the crowd he had always been able to buy. But their faces had changed. Fear had left them, and a man like Silas Crowley had nothing left when the fear was gone. "This is nonsense," he sputtered. "You cannot take the word of a criminal woman over mine. I am the most respected man in this valley." "Not anymore," Martha said, plain as day. Judge Harmon lifted his gavel. He looked at Silas long and hard, and there was no mercy in his eyes. "Silas Crowley," the judge said, "the evidence before this court is overwhelming. Fraud, coercion, the theft of land through threat and force, and by your own scheme, the near murder of 3 infants and their mother." He let the words settle. "I find in favor of Eliza Boone. Her name is cleared of every charge against her, and this court will begin at once the return of all land stolen through your corruption to its rightful owners." The gavel came down. The room erupted. Word of the verdict spread through the valley like wind across an open field. By the next morning, folks were already gathering at Eliza Boone's old farmstead. They came with hammers and saws, with wagons full of fresh-cut lumber, with buckets of nails and rolls of wire, and everything a broken place needed to be made whole again. The Hensons came, the Palmers, the Coles, all the families Silas had chased off their land, standing now on ground that was theirs once more. Caleb arrived at first light, his breath fogging in the cold. He tied his horse and rolled up his sleeves without a word. That was how he worked. Quiet, steady. But when he looked around at the crowd, something warm stirred in his chest. There had to be 40 people there, maybe more. "Never thought I'd see this place standing again," said old Mr. Henson, leaning on a fence post. His voice cracked. "Thought Crowley had taken it for good." "He took a lot of things," Caleb said. "Turns out he couldn't keep none of them." The barn had half collapsed over the winter. The roof of the house sagged low, and the porch had rotted clean through. But hands make quick work when there are many of them, and there was no shortage of hands that week. Men climbed the rafters and raised new beams. Women scrubbed the floors and stitched fresh curtains and filled the pantry with jars of preserves. Children ran between the workers carrying water and tools, laughing in a way that made the whole place feel alive again. Martha stood in the middle of it all, calling out orders like a general. "Mind that beam, boys. Mary, those windows won't wash themselves. And somebody get that stove lit before we all freeze solid." Caleb caught her eye across the yard. She winked at him. By the 3rd day, the barn stood tall and true. The house had a new roof and a porch a man could dance on. Smoke curled from the chimney for the first time in months. And the folks of the valley, who had once turned their faces away from one another out of fear, now sat together at long tables in the yard, sharing bread and stew and stories. Fear had ruled them for so long. Now, in its place, there was something far stronger. There was each other. On the 4th day, the wagon carrying the babies came up the road. Caleb heard it before he saw it, the creak of wheels, the soft cries drifting on the wind. He set down his hammer and turned, and his heart began to hammer harder than any nail he had ever driven. Eliza was already waiting on the new porch, her wrapped leg propped on a stool, her hands trembling in her lap. The wagon rolled to a stop. Martha climbed down first, then reached back and lifted a bundle wrapped in wool. Then another. 3 tiny faces peered out into the cold, their cheeks pink, their eyes bright. Clara, Samuel, Rose. Bring them here, Eliza whispered. Please, bring them to me. Martha carried the first baby up the steps and laid her gently in Eliza's arms. Eliza pressed her face against the small warm cheek and began to weep. Not sad tears, the kind that come when a heart that has been broken for too long finally mends. My babies, she said over and over. My babies. Mama's here. Mama never left you. My mama's here. One by one, all three were placed in her arms. She held them close, all together, rocking them, kissing their heads, her tears falling free. The whole crowd had gone quiet. Grown men wiped their eyes with rough sleeves. Women held one another. And then somebody began to clap, and then another, and soon the whole yard rang with it. But they were not clapping only for Eliza. They were clapping for Caleb. He stood at the edge of the crowd, trying to disappear, but they would not let him. Mr. Henson clasped his shoulder. A young mother pressed his hand. Voices rose all around him. There he is, the man who pulled them from the ice. He saved those babies. He saved this whole valley. Caleb ducked his head, his throat tight. He was not a man for praise. But when he looked up and saw Eliza gazing at him over the heads of her 3 children, her eyes shining with a gratitude no words could hold, he could not look away. She mouthed 2 words to him. Thank you. Spring came slow to the valley that year, but when it came all at once. The snow melted off the hills and left behind green so bright it hurt to look at. Wildflowers pushed up along the fence lines, and Caleb's ranch, which had sat quiet and cold for so many years, woke up like a thing that had been holding its breath. Now it never stopped moving. Caleb stood on the porch in the morning light, a cup of coffee warming his hands, and listened. There was always noise now. The clatter of pots from the kitchen, the bark of the old dog that had wandered up one day and never left, and underneath it all, the sound he had once thought he would never hear again in his own home. Children laughing. The triplets were near a year old now, and they were into everything. Clara had learned to crawl faster than any baby had a right to, and she made straight for trouble every chance she got. Samuel liked to sit and watch the world with big serious eyes, the way his grandfather Daniel must have once. And Rose, sweet Rose, laughed at everything. A bird, a shadow, the wind in the curtains. Her laugh could pull a smile out of the hardest heart. It had pulled plenty out of Caleb's. You gonna stand there all day? Eliza called through the open door. Or are you gonna help me with these young ones? Caleb grinned and set down his cup. Coming. Inside, the house was warm and full. Eliza moved easy now, her leg long since healed, though she still favored it on cold mornings. She had made this place her own without ever meaning to. Curtains she had sewn hung in the windows. Bread she had baked cooled on the table. And the babies she had once left on the ice to save their lives now crawled across a floor that was safe and warm, and theirs. Martha visited most days. She came with pies and advice and opinions on everything, and Caleb would not have had it any other way. The neighbors came too. The Hensons, the Palmers. Folks who had once been too afraid to look each other in the eye now filled his yard on Sundays, sharing food and stories and the simple gift of one another's company. Caleb scooped up Rose, who reached for his beard with her tiny fist and squealed with delight. She's got you wrapped around her finger, Eliza said. That she does. Caleb kissed the baby's head. All 3 of them do. Eliza looked at him then, quiet for a moment. Daniel would have liked this, she said softly. You, here, with us. He always said you were the best man he ever knew. Caleb's throat tightened. For years those words would have broken him. Now they only warmed him. He was the best man I knew, Caleb said. I aim to spend the rest of my days proving him right. That afternoon, while the babies napped and the house went still, Caleb walked out alone. He knew where his feet were taking him. He had known before he ever stood up. The creek ran fast and free now, the winter ice long gone. Water tumbled over the rocks, catching the sun in bright silver flashes. Birds sang in the willows along the bank. It was hard to believe this gentle place had once been so cruel. Caleb stood where he had stood that terrible night. He remembered the cracking ice, the freezing dark, the 3 small cries that had reached him through the storm and pulled him back from a place he had been drowning in for years. He had come here that night, thinking he had nothing left to give. He had been wrong. Caleb knelt beside the water and pressed his hand flat against the cold ground. He thought of his wife, his daughter. The years he had spent believing his heart was frozen solid, buried under grief too heavy to move. But hearts, it turned out, were not so different from creeks. What froze in winter could run again come spring. I thought I saved them, he murmured, watching the water rush by. His eyes stung, but he was smiling. Truth is, they saved me. The water sang on, and Caleb Hart, who had come to this creek a broken man, rose up whole. By the time Caleb walked back up from the creek, the yard had come alive. Wagons rolled in one after another, their wheels crunching over the dirt road. Folks climbed down carrying baskets and blankets and jars of preserves. Someone had strung ribbons along the porch rail, and they fluttered bright in the spring wind. A long table stretched across the yard, already sagging under the weight of pies and roasted chicken, and bowls of fresh greens. Caleb stopped and stared. He had known there would be a gathering. He had not known it would be this. Surprise, Martha said, appearing at his elbow with a grin as wide as the valley. You didn't think we'd let a whole year go by without marking it, did you? Martha, Caleb started, but the words caught in his throat. Don't you go getting soft on me now, Caleb Hart. There's eating to be done. But her eyes were shining, and she squeezed his arm before bustling off to boss someone about where to set the lemonade. The Hensons were there, the Palmers, Sheriff Tom Dawson out of his uniform for once, laughing at something a neighbor said. Faces Caleb had known his whole life, and some he had only come to know this past year. All of them here, all of them on his land. Eliza came across the yard with Rose on her hip, and Clara toddling behind, clutching her skirt. Samuel rode high on the shoulders of one of the Palmer boys, gripping fistfuls of hair and shrieking with joy. You didn't tell me, Caleb said. Couldn't, Eliza said. It wouldn't have been a surprise then. She smiled, but there was something deeper behind it. They wanted to do this. All of them. Not for the babies. For you. Caleb shook his head. I only did what any man would have done. No, said a voice behind him. Tom Dawson stepped forward, hat in hand. You did what no other man in this county did. You saw those children on the ice, and you went in after them when the rest of us would have called it hopeless. He looked around at the gathered crowd. And you didn't stop there. You went and pulled the truth out of the dark, same as you pulled those babies out of the water. Half these folks wouldn't be standing tall today if you hadn't shown them how. A murmur of agreement rippled through the yard. Somebody clapped, then somebody else. And soon the whole crowd was clapping, hats lifted, voices rising, calling Caleb's name. Caleb stood in the middle of it, cheeks burning, not knowing what to do with his hands. For a man who had spent so many years alone, the sound of it was almost too much to bear. Almost. Martha climbed up on the porch step and raised her arms until the noise settled. I want to say something, she declared. A year ago, this ranch was the quietest place I ever knew. Quiet as a grave. I used to look up here at night and see no lights, and it broke my heart. She paused, her voice going soft. Now look at it. Full of children, full of neighbors, full of life. That's what one brave heart can do. That's what happens when a man decides to love again instead of hide. She lifted her glass. To Caleb Hart, and to the family he found on the ice. To Caleb, the crowd echoed. The afternoon rolled on in laughter and music, and the good tired joy of people who had once forgotten how to gather. A fiddle came out. Children chased the old dog around the yard. Eliza pressed a plate into Caleb's hands and made him eat, and Martha argued with Mrs. Henson over whose pie crust was finer. And for once, nobody was afraid of anything. When the sun began to sink low, painting the hills gold and rose, Caleb found himself off to the side of the yard, watching. The triplets played in the grass, tumbling and giggling in the last warm light. Clara plucked at a wildflower. Samuel watched a bird lift off the fence. Rose laughed at nothing at all, the way she always did, her whole small body shaking with the pure joy of being alive. Caleb watched them, and his chest went full and tight all at once. He had jumped into that icy creek, believing he was saving 3 helpless babies. He had crawled across the cracking ice, sure that he was the strong one, the rescuer, the man with nothing left to lose. He understood now how wrong he had been. They had been the ones reaching for him, reaching through the storm and the dark and the frozen years to pull him back to shore. He had gone into that water, a man who was already drowning, and 3 small cries had lifted him out. The loneliness that had haunted him for so long was gone. In its place was this: a porch full of neighbors, a woman who called him family, 3 children laughing in the golden light. Caleb Hart drew a slow breath, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, his heart was at peace. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.